Oh, hey there! Welcome back to the second annual Incredibly Nerdy Award Show, where I will be crowning the various books that I read with various silly superlatives. I did this last year and I had a ton of fun doing it, so I thought, why not make it a little tradition between you and I? I will be including my top 10 reads of 2024. This year I did put them in order, with the #1 book being my absolute favorite read of this year. I was brave, I did the hard thing. But enough with the prologue, let's just get started. The first little superlative, the most fun to read, aka our class clown, and this one goes to Catalina by Karla Villavicencio. I laughed out loud with this book. I often read it while I was commuting and could not hold my guffaws. I don't know how else to say it. It wasn't a giggle, it was like an absolute scoff, but in partnership. Like, I was on her team the entire time. So this is a story of Catalina. Catalina is extremely dramatic, extremely funny. She's undocumented. So we watch her navigate like the weird intersection between privilege and mobility as she is accepted to Harvard. She is a blast to reside alongside. Like, her thoughts are just really interesting. She's constantly interrogating all of the systems that she is reluctantly a part of or has in protest sort of kicked her way into. She's also hopelessly romantic but super critical of the institution of romance, and so she's incredibly contradictory, which is like my favorite type of narrator. This has a very faint plot line, but if you enjoy being alongside someone that's very precocious and extremely funny, I would highly recommend reading this book. For the release of this, Karla had a conversation with Jia Tolentino at Books Are Magic. It was a brain-bendy conversation. There are some writers whose work alone is fantastic, but also just like their brain and hearing them talk and how they conceptualize like fiction. Especially for her, she's writing a Latinx character, and I think there's a lot of expectation and there's a lot of pigeonholing that comes with writing about that identity. Hearing her talk about how she's very bored by stereotypes and she absolutely refused to box herself into that was a favorite thing of mine. So I'm definitely gonna link that down below. Just to get a taste of Catalina, one of the lines, "I don't have stomach for violence." I was, however, very interested in organized crime. There was a scene where she's with a love interest in the book and she says, "I was afraid Nathaniel was gonna tell me he loved me when he came. I would be so embarrassed if he did, and I held his face in my hands the whole time, hoping he would. Later, he fell asleep on top of me. I was too young to have men falling asleep on top of me." I want to see more of Karla's fiction out in the world. So if you're looking for a campus novel that's rompy and smart, but also kind of grounded, because there is the through line, the uncertainty of their status as undocumented people in the States, and just how we can handle stories from diverse backgrounds. I don't know, I just found this to be like such a great blueprint maybe for what our stories can tell. The coolest reading discovery of 2024, and this one's gonna have to go to a return to translated fiction, especially fiction coming from Latin America. Last year, one of my reading intentions was seeking out diverse reads, and I really kind of wanted to step outside of things that were published in the US and reach towards translated fiction. A couple of years ago, I was really into things that were translated from Latin America, and then I sort of lost my habit with that. I really wanted to be intentional about reaching towards those types of books, and it ended up being totally worth it because I found a lot of great translated works, a lot of which ended up being some of my favorite reads of this year. Books that are translated from Latin America tend to have this little bit of the unusual, which I love. The Paris Review has these collection of interviews. They had one called Latin American Writers at Work, and there was an interview with Luisa Valenzuela, and she had a quote and I loved it, and it said, "I'm quite disturbed when American reviewers call my fiction surrealist. I consider it realist in excess. Latin American writers think of reality as having a wider span, that's all. We explore the shadow side of it." That's what I especially love about literary fiction from Latin America, and I'm just happy to be back in her arms. So that is definitely like one of the discoveries or reacquaintings that I am very happy about in 2024. Biggest bookish surprise. This little superlative is always like a lesson. What did I learn from my reading? And like 2 years ago, there was this book that was published and it was super buzzy, and I read it and I didn't understand the hype. I didn't understand why everyone, their mother, their grandmother, all of the family members were raving about this book, and I just didn't get it. I kind of wrote off everything by this writer. I like tried to read her new nonfiction. I walked in with my biases, right? Like, they were all cradled in my arms and I wasn't giving her a fair shot. So eventually enough time passed and I did give her like a third shot, and I ended up absolutely loving this book. And that book is A Horse at Night by Amina Kane. This is a little like collection of meanderings on Amina's process with writing. So it looks at how she contemplates literature, the things that she looks for in texts, the type of writing that has informed her work. And so you end up leaving this piece of writing with like a really hefty, substantial, wonderful list of readers to explore for yourself. But something that I also really liked about this book was that it felt really intimate and really grand granular. While she was exploring writing and the themes around writing and what it is to be a writer and what it is to be a reader, she was also looking at these like small ephemera. And so it was really nice to see her like pull them to the center, roll them out, and like pin them to the text and like celebrate them. So she was talking about things like darkness, a dimly lit street, snow, female solitude, all of these like intangibles. I really love that about this book. It's one that I listened to on audio while I was like walking through the parks, and I feel like that's a perfect way to listen to this. But this definitely taught me to keep my mind open, especially to myself and to my little judgments, because it would have been really unfortunate if I had denied myself this book. Next one is Best New Author to me. I have two, but I'm going to talk about one of the authors later. So the second author, or the first author, the author that ended up winning is absolutely Claudia Piñero. This year I read Elena Knows, I read All Yours, and I'm currently reading Time of the Flies. And I am so obsessed with how Piñero tells stories. She's always saying something really interesting, and the way that she is embodying the questions that she has is the most fun thing to sit alongside in her novels. Piñero is often classified as like a crime writer or a thriller writer, and her novels often really have high stakes, and so it's a little bit faster paced than the literary fiction that I'm used to, but her writing still maintains the essence of what I love about literary fiction, which is this really ruthless interrogation of characters, and not just characters that are trying to push like a moral whatever. It's always characters that are really imperfect, contradictory, blind spotty, and constantly making the wrong choices, but we get to see their thought processes in those choices, and we get to dislike her characters but also understand her characters. So she just does really wonderful things with how she develops her characters that I really appreciate. I love the honesty with which she paints and illustrates her characters. And there's always a little bit of humor to her novels. It's sort of like the kind of humor that dulls an extreme. It's like I'm gonna start laughing because otherwise I'd start crying kind of thing. Like it's always these heightened experiences. She always tries to soften the landing with humor, which I think is a very human inclination, which I also think adds to the humanity. She has like an incredibly sharp pen, and she has this fidelity to the infuriating and the ugly and the hypocritical and the heartbreaking and beautiful aspects of humanity. I absolutely love her. Most likely to be reread. I am probably going to reread this book because I don't think I got it the first time, but this book was so fascinating, and it's interesting because the whole time I was reading it I was like, oh, this is another translated work from Latin America, and it was not, and I thought it was because it was so weird. But this one was It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Anne DeMarkin. So this one is a literary zombie novel where we meet our narrator, who is unnamed, but not because like the writer is trying to make a craft choice, it's because she can't remember her name. So we're already starting off this book with the stripping of identity, and then we're asking the question, what maintains a person's essence? She's constantly thinking of her partner, who she can't remember their name either. The weight of the love that she holds for this person is so palpable throughout, but to not remember something so essential and central to a person like someone's name, and is that something that's like super central and essential to a person? So she's asking a lot of these questions. Oh, and the landscape is like pretty illegible. It might be the afterlife. There's a mix of undead people and maybe alive people. She's moving through this landscape, and there are like these very strange things that happen all throughout. She's sort of working through grief, and she's sort of working through memory and how we keep things alive and what makes us alive. There's a crow that she physically tucks into her chest and binds so that she can hold on to it. It's sort of this animating of grief. It's just such a weird, heartbreaking, fantastic exploration of how we hold on to the things that we love and what it means to be alive or to be forgotten. All of these great questions. I kept saying that this felt like if Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World had a child with Ali Smith's writing, that would be this book. Like, it was very whimsical. There was a lot of experimentation around how movement is described in this book. There was a lot of experimentation around the language of this book. It was very playful. It didn't take itself seriously at all. There was something so soft about our narrator and something so full of yearning about our narrator, and I was really taken. I like lost my walls and like my sense of place when I was reading this book. It was really engulfing, and like I always say that I'm not a fan of things that like pull me too much out of my reality. Like, I need to have both my feet on the ground still. This one did that, but I was okay because I felt like I was in really sturdy hands with DeMarkin's work. Like, her prose is beautiful, the construction. I was just curious to see where we would end up with our character. Ending scene was super bizarre. It felt like being in a Dali painting. Like, everything was melting and melding. Just like a really cool experiment in this book. Okay, next, my most anticipated book going into 2024. I'm going to absolutely shock you with my answer. The most anticipated book that I had going into 2024 was Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I know, we're shocked. Intermezzo is a story about two brothers, Peter and Ivan. We meet them just as they've lost their father. So the brothers are dealing with grief, but in Rooney fashion, we're also looking at connection and miscommunication. We're looking at dynamics of power and sex and love, all of it. She does all of it. This is my official favorite Sally Rooney to date. I think it's such a mature iteration of her work. I love seeing how the analysis that she usually cling wraps around romantic relationships, she applies to the sibling dynamic as well. And like the sibling dynamic, because of the loss of this really major person in the family's dynamic, the brothers are also trying to understand their new roles. So it's really interesting to see how things like attempts at connection, miscommunication, dynamics of power play within sibling dynamics as well. Peter and Ivan are also both in age gap relationships. Peter is currently dating two women, kinda. He's dating a significantly younger girl and is maintaining ties with an ex-girlfriend who was like they were pretty serious. Ivan is also in an age gap relationship. So Ivan is our 22-year-old chess prodigy and he is dating a significantly older woman, a 36-year-old Margaret. Both are trying to understand the dynamics of these relationships, which are not like co-signed by society, so to speak. And they're trying to understand what is true to them and what feels right to them. And we just watch them like clunk and clumsy their way towards a life that feels right, something that resembles acceptance towards themselves and towards each other. It's just like a really layered, excellent novel. The writing is a little bit experimental in this and a little bit referential. I've not read James Joyce, but apparently she pays homage to his writing style. A lot of the emotionality that Rooney was trying to capture, I think, is bottled well in the style that she chose. In this book, something that we're exploring is being really familiar with constantly wanting and how getting the object of your desire is not something that is like super familiar to one of our characters. And so he's talking about like what it means to desire this person and for that desire to be reciprocated. And Ivan says, is this how it feels, he thinks, to get what you want, to desire and at the same time to have, still desiring but fulfilled. There's another one where he says, rather than smiling this time, he felt a kind of acute feeling, almost like pain, opening out inside himself, and his eyes were stinging. To love and for his love to be accepted. It was in fact painful, the relief of all that compression suddenly, to say the words aloud and hear her saying them, to be loved by her. It was so needed that it actually hurt. And then my favorite line, they're having like a little debate on like, what is God? Is God beauty? Is God like right and wrong? Insert the God. There's always a God quote in Rooney's writing, but she lets out a trembling kind of laugh. Well, if there is a God, she says, I'm sure he loves you very much. He lowers his eyes. Yeah, I can feel that sometimes, he says. Like when I'm with you, I can, if you don't mind me saying that. Yeah, she did that. Absolute banger. Love this book. My most read author in 2024. Again, we're shocked by this answer, but it was Sally Rooney. When I was in Ireland this summer, I read Normal People and Conversations with Friends. When I got back, no, right before I left, I read this, and then when I got back, I read her short story, which I hadn't read before, called Mr. Salary. So it was definitely the year of the Rune for me, and I'm not mad about it. The best debut novel that I read. I didn't actually read a lot of debut novels. I'll put out an honorable mention to Victim by Andrew Borjega. This was like, it was ambitious, but one that like really brought up a lot of interesting questions and that I was just sort of spiraling with was Annibot by Sierra Greer. So this is a story about a SEX robot that gains consciousness. We have this dude, Doug, who buys this like robot woman because he's like gone through a bad divorce and he can't stomach the idea of having to be with a real woman. And in this like timeline, it's an expensive but like pretty common thing that happens. Like men are buying different tiers of robot. They have just like the SEX robots. They have the robots that'll clean and cook. It's like extricating domesticity, what women can offer into these machines. But our robot chick, Annie, she's a special kind of robot because she has this like emerging consciousness. So she's like a very curious robot who is interested in coding, but she's not allowed to be interested in coding because like she's a robot. She can't like mess with her own programming. She's really inquiring, which is really cool to watch something that has been programmed for compliance to sort of bend and eventually break out of that. But it's probably the exact opposite of what you want when you buy a robot for compliance, right? right? So there's a lot of tension between Annie and Doug throughout the novel. We're watching this robot who has been programmed for compliance begin to engage in moral grays, begin to hold secrets, begin to question and push against compliance. This book was looking at things like autonomy, liberation, what does it mean to be free, what defines humanity. There was so much affection and buy-in to our character, our narrator's humanity, but then also the constant reminding that she was like programming, she was code. So what makes a person human? Is it historical memory? Is it anatomically physical parts? Or is it compassion and empathy and innocence and curiosity? What is the meaty thing of like humanity? What is it comprised of? It also looked at the ideas of transgression and consent in really fascinating ways, in ways that like sort of deviated from the norm or had you thinking about it in different ways. I felt like the questions that were asked in this were really cool. The decision of the character at the end of the novel was really cool. I listened to this one on audio and like had a really good time reading it. A book that did not live up to the hype. I think I mentioned this last year that this probably would not be a yearbook superlative, but it's my game and I make the rules. So a book that I saw was pretty well praised across the board and which on paper seems like my precise cup of tea was Splinters by Leslie Jameson. So this is a memoir recounting a mother's early days of mothering, but also she's going through a divorce. So it's like holding those two things and she's like seeking autonomy and she's trying to maintain who she was before the arrival of this child. And she's also trying to find herself in the face of this divorce. And I did in the beginning, I was like kind of hooked to it. Like it was super readable. It was very easy to enter Jameson's world. And I don't know if like maybe my meter or baseline for what's interesting is a little bit messed up because I read very weird books, but I wasn't sure if like maybe Jameson didn't have enough distance from the divorce and from the early days of motherhood, or if she was scared to be seen as anything outside of like an effusive, loving mother. And it's not to say that you're not allowed to be obsessed with your kid, but it felt almost a little bit grating at how black and white in like the expected ways she was sort of communicating her like disdain for her husband and like her absolute adoration for her child. Like there was nothing like really interesting or provocative about what she was sharing. It kind of to me felt like she was a little bit scared, or she was not scared but like very preoccupied around what perception of her as a mother would feel like, or her as a wife would feel like, which I felt a little bit uncomfortable with because it just didn't feel honest. If you're like super concerned with outward perception, it's hard to arrive at anything interesting. Maybe that's an erroneous stance on my part because this is a memoir and it's her experience, and if she was like really feeling like all of these black and white feelings, who am I to say that that's like wrong? And I'm not saying that it's wrong, but for the sake of an interesting narrative, like there was nothing there for me to like, you know, swim in or sink myself into. In terms of just making me think about things in a new way, it didn't do any of that, and it doesn't have to, but I also then don't have to read it. The most playful novel that I read this year, that one goes to All Fours by Miranda July. I had a feeling that July and I were gonna get along real well. So essentially this is a book on desire. Desire specifically after a woman has been deemed visible in society. So what is desire after 40? The book starts off with this premise. There are two types of people in the world. There are drivers and there are parkers, and she's called a parker. And she takes great offense to that. And she says, I am absolutely not a parker. I am a driver. I am someone who's forward moving and about it. To prove her family wrong, she decides to take a road trip and then ends up finding a motel like 15 minutes from her home and essentially parking there for an extended amount of time. Here she meets this dude. He's a Hertz driver / dancer, and they have this very intense, intimate affair, but there's never any sex, which is super fascinating. We're exploring desire and we're exploring what it means to want. The structures that we're sort of told we have to abide by and fit into, and how she dismantles that and makes a structure for herself, and how liberating it is to be allowed to make that structure. Something that I really enjoyed about this novel was that it was looking at the time in a woman's life where she is no longer visible. By visible, we mean like has lost her youth and has lost her currency. What happens to that woman? July offers something so capacious and so malleable and so empowering that we are allowed to define whatever it is that comes after being pressed down by the pressures of society, because that sort of gaze has moved on from us. So like this was a really fantastic exploration, and it was really, really funny. It was very sexy. And again, there's not a lot of like explicit sex in this. It sort of really bends a lot of our expectations around what life is supposed supposed to be. I deeply, thoroughly enjoyed this book, and I thought it handled very lightly, but also very masterfully something that could be like really depressing and heavy. So super, super playful little read that I very much enjoyed. Most experimental. So this one I'm going to crown, honestly, it lasts forever and then it's over. Could probably fit in this one for its like thematic exploration, but I think in terms of form is gonna go to The Alternatives by Keelan Hughes. So this is a novel about four very, very brainy PhD holding sisters. One has an honorary degree, but they're all very esteemed and renowned in their own field. One of them is a geologist, and she is sort of feeling the brunt and how looming the climate crisis is. On top of this, like her students are annoying and she's in a weird domestic situation, and so she absconds. She flees somewhere in Ireland, and all of the sisters go on a road trip to try to find her. Initially, the book is very traditionally structured, but then once all of the sisters meet, it goes from being a novel structure into a play. And so we start to see their interactions in this very like theatrical way where there are all of these monologues and dialogues. It's really, really fun, especially on audio because there is a cast. There is a cast of characters. It's so fun and dynamic to experience this book. It is a very like up here kind of read, but just in terms of how it communicated sisterhood and togetherness, but also like the seek for autonomy and how to care for one another, I thought it was done in such an interesting way. Most likely to break your heart, another Irish read. This one is Foster by Claire Keegan. This is my favorite Keegan so far. This one is about a young girl in a family who is sent to spend the summer with another family who can care for her a little bit better because her mom is currently pregnant. When our character spends her summer with this new family, she is cared for and attended to in a way that's very dissimilar from the norms of her daily life. And the reason for the way that she is cared for bubbles up to the surface. So we're learning about all of these secrets with this family and sort of the things that haunt us, and how that haunting doesn't always have to be negative, how the things from our past can really positively impact our future despite how tragic they might be. And so in the end, how we have to rearrange ourselves into a prior life when we've become larger, when our capacity for love has become larger, and how we sort of speak or what we don't say in order to sort of assert ourselves in that new life. It's such a slim little novel, but I think it's doing so much in it. It is a child narrator, and I think Keegan does a child narrator so well. There's something very like innocent and pliable, but also like astute about our narrator. The ending broke my heart. I did cry. So this one is most likely to break your heart. In a similar vein, but not quite, we have Best Shoulder to Cry On for all of y'all who like to be emotionally manipulated by books. This one is actually not emotionally manipulative. This is a non-fiction book by Cristina Rivera Garza, Liliana's Invincible Summer, or in Spanish, El Invencible Verano de Liliana. I believe it won the National Book Award. This is a story or a recounting of Liliana's life and the murder that took it. Someone on Instagram called this life-telling instead of storytelling, and it's basically looking at Liliana's life through her diaries, but also through the sort of fabrics of Mexico City, the history and the statistics with femicide. We just see how Cristina has learned to live alongside the grief of her sister, especially when she has been murdered. I say that this is a good shoulder to cry on because there's one part in this book, I read it in Spanish so I don't have the quote, but she's talking about how oftentimes we think of grief as the beginning of loneliness. And Cristina sort of offers the idea that once a person dies, that is the end of loneliness, and that all of a sudden everything that happens to you, every magical thing that happens to you, you sort of ascribe to that person. And I had never thought about grief in that way, but I think it's a beautiful way to sort of tether yourself to someone who's no longer there and to reframe that loss into this like permanent feeling of accompaniment that I don't think we often associate with grief. And even how Cristina handles the murder of her sister, I think anyone in that position would be incredibly rageful and angry, but she is always so dedicated to the life essence of Liliana, of like her hopes and her aspirations and how deeply she loved, and that was something that was always held up in the book. The biggest flirt, and this one is just here for a little bit of levity, but biggest flirt will go to my queen, Emily Henry. She came out with a new book, Funny Story, and that was a lot of fun. It's like an ex swap, which I didn't know was a thing, but it's a thing. I think Emily Henry is always so good at banter, and she's always so good at maintaining tensions, and this one, I've said this before, but this was her least spicy book, but I think it was incredibly flirty. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit light and a little bit of a reprieve, if your reading list tends to be just generally heavy, I would go for some Emily Henry. Okay, so we're finally to the fun stuff. So top 10 reads of 2024. There were some great books read this year. I'm happy about my reading year. I didn't read as much as I typically do, but I think that's okay. I think I just have to reassess who I am as a reader. Post-pandemic, I'm not gonna be reading 70 books anymore, and that's okay. But I did read some really great books. So I'm gonna go from number 10 to number 1, and number 1 will be my absolute favorite read of this year. Number 10 was Karla by Colin Walsh. This is a debut novel by an Irish writer from Galway. It's a literary thriller. I honestly did not know that this might be my thing. I'm not completely sure if it's my thing yet, but I'm definitely interested because I think I've been reading a lot of like literary crime, literary zombie, literary thriller books. I'm wondering, I used to say that I was a plotless girly through and through, but I'm wondering if I need a little bit of plot. So we have this group of friends, one of whom was murdered many, many years ago. Years after, all of the friends for some reason have come back together in this small town in Ireland, and a lot of the secrets from that murder start to reemerge in a very peculiar way. The character development in this is gorgeous. There is so much affection that you grow for a lot of the characters. Two in particular for me. It's a story about secrets. It's a story about how patterns sort of replicate themselves, and it's just so beautifully written. I absolutely enjoyed my time with this one, and I definitely am so curious about Colin Walsh. I'm so excited for anything else that he publishes. His writing is just so delicious. I'll share some of the sentences, and it was just like fragments, like the stutter of the fluorescent bulb above me. Yum. The ribs of the earth pushing through my runners. There was one part where one of the characters was talking and he says, "Good night so far," Aiden said. He was speaking with that sort of sighing voice that old lads have as they squint over gates, like the world is a sum they could do in their heads if they were bothered. Adrenaline-y book that I enjoyed. Number 9 is Rejection by Tulatha Moody. This, first of all, thank you Janice, because she like texted me randomly and was like, "You must read this book," and then she conspired to send me the ebook even though like it wasn't working because I was in a different country. But I read this when I was in the Dominican Republic and could not put it down. I think I read it in 2 days. This is a collection of short stories that is exploring the difficulties in connection. It's exploring loneliness. It's exploring the postures of political correctness and what happens when rejection sort of topples that over. What's the anger and the resentments that sort of sputter up in the face of that? It was so fascinating. I think there were a lot of interesting choices that Tulatha Moody makes in these short stories. So like the first short story is about this incel-y dude who is like a feminist and proclaimed ally. He's constantly complaining about the fact that like no one wants to have sex with him, and he's like, you know, everyone is hypocritical. They all say like we should stop centering romance and start centering platonic friendships, but then like no one is available because everyone is still centering romance. No one will date me. And then there's one girl who wants to date him, but he's like, not her. And then the second story is that one girl who wants to date him, but he has rejected, and we see her sort of have like this one night stand with this guy. The guy pulls back and doesn't want anything to do with her, and we see her try to be like the cool girl. He introduces this new friend, swears up and down that they're not dating, but then starts dating her, and we see how her political correctness falters when all of a sudden this guy is dating this new girl. There's all of this racial stuff that comes out. So it's really interesting because all of the characters in the collection of short stories are somehow connected, like it's interconnecting stories, but they're all struggling over connection, which I thought was such a fascinating choice. In the third story, we see that one character goes on like a random date with this guy. He convinces her to take a trip to Spain or something. She doesn't ask her job properly and then is like on the rocks with her job, and he's like, "Quit your job, come move in with me." Eventually she moves in with him. He lives in like a 1-bedroom apartment. He's like, "I'm working on my long-term goal, so I don't really need much more space than this. I'm optimizing. I don't really use the oven, so you can put your stuff in there." It's like very bizarre. She's like really depressed, and he's like, "You know what? I'm gonna help her with her depression by blocking texts coming into her phone from her friends, because I think they're just distracting her from like her goals." So he like installs a firmware on her phone so that she's essentially isolated. And then he's like, she seems really catatonic and is only cleaning one spot in the apartment. Something's off. And he knows this because of the cameras that are installed in the apartment. He like continues to intervene and intervene and intervene. It just gets really dark and dystopic. Tulatha Moody is kind of looking at the ideals that we think will make us loved, and then alongside this, the insecurities that we all house, and how quickly the ugly things sprout up when we are threatened through something like rejection. How we yield to anger in the face of rejection. Also really interesting because we never see like vulnerability or softness or introspection in these characters. It's always like something happens to them and they like cast outward, right? Like they're casting all these aspersions outward. All of the stories are really defensive and they're very armored. In the end, Tony kicks down the fourth wall, and then he sort of makes his text invulnerable to rejection by like over intellectualizing rejection and like armoring the entire short story collection. And so that if you don't like it as a reader, the rejection is intentional, so you can't even reject the piece of work. Like, it is such a fascinating, like what is done in this short story collection is absolutely incredible, and I think everyone should read this. It was such an exhilarating, dicey read that I so enjoyed. Number 7 is Liars by Sarah Manguso. I still think about this book. I still remember how angry this book makes me. So this is a story about a woman, Jane, who's in a marriage with John. The book starts off with a really great quote. "In the beginning, I was only myself. Everything that happened to me I thought was mine alone. Then I married a man, as women do. My life became archetypal, a drag show of nuclear familyhood. I got enmeshed in a story that had already been told 10 billion times. But before all that, back at the beginning, I remember looking out the door of my apartment, watching John's head appear as he climbed the stairs, and then step by step more and more of him, which is when I said, 'You're real,' which was my first mistake." It's a woman who is talking about her marriage to this man who, in the most covert way, belittles her and siphons from her. They're both writers, and to see this man prioritize and center his art at the expense, literal expense and diminishment of hers, of her artistic identity. We watch him sort of like push all of the domestic responsibilities onto her and then like gaslight her while he's doing it. It is the most enraging book to read, but I think it's such a great look at the silent battles. It's one that like I could not wait to like be done with, but not because I wasn't enjoying it, but just because what I was housing in here was very uncomfortable and I wanted to fight this man very badly. There are some other quotes that I really enjoyed. I thought if I had the energy, I'd leave him, and then folded up that little thought, wrapped it in gauze, and swallowed it. There's another quote, and I really like this one, where she says, "When I was young, I'd sworn I'd never marry. I'd understood back then that commitment was a trap that closed off otherwise accessible exit routes. Then I had therapy for 10 years and learned that commitment was a gift, the ability to give your heart to another. Then, more than a decade into marriage, I had to relearn that it's also the other thing, the trap. It's both. I felt stupid having to relearn something that 30 years ago I'd already known." This was such a sticky, memorable book for me this year. Number 6 is Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro. It's a pretty popular book. We have this mother, Elena, and one day her daughter, Rita, is found hanging in a belfry in a church. The conditions of that day, it was raining, it was thundering. Rita was absolutely terrified of rain and thunder. So the mother's like, it could not have been a suicide, which is what everyone was saying, that like she had hung herself in the church. And her mother was adamant that that's not what the case was. And so in the story, we watch this mother sort of look for the truths of what happened to her daughter. She's moving through the city in order to find these answers. But the movement in this novel is hindered by Elena's physical condition. She's a woman with Parkinson's, and so her mobility and ability to have autonomy over her body is impacted. And so there is this constant tension within this book between Elena and her desires to find answers around her daughter. But as the mother is moving through the city, we're seeing like these glimpses of these memories. We're sort of seeing the realities of the relationship between Elena and Rita, and we're realizing that it is a very tense and very combative, acrimonious relationship. There's a lot of fighting and disagreements, but there's also fidelity and servitude. In those memories, we sort of see like maybe Rita's resentment about her role to her mother, how she has to be in service of her mother because of her mother's condition. And we learn about the death of Rita. There is like this element of thrill and trying to arrive at an answer, but just the way that, again, Claudia is able to embody the questions that she's asking in her work within her characters, within the intricacies of who the characters are, the sort of difficulties that they have, is fantastic. Number 6 is a book that I read literally this time last year, and it was just like in the margins of 2023 and 2024. And you know, timing on this totally matters because I almost left this off the list, but this was, I remember, a book that I found so special. Juno Loves Legs by Carl Geary. It's a book I gave 6 stars to when I read. Essentially, we have these two friends, we have Juno and Legs, and we first meet them when they are in Catholic school in Dublin. Legs is a character who is queer, and so a lot of the teachers, I would say bully, but they put bows in his hairs and are really inappropriate with him. And we see Juno work to protect him. She feels very protective over Legs. Something that I really love about this book are the scenes that Geary creates. Like, there are some scenes here that absolutely took my breath away. Eventually there is an incident in which a violence happens and Legs is sent away. So her lifeline, her best friend is sent away. And we see her sort of try to navigate a pretty tumultuous home life, a lot of hardships there in a lot of different ways that happen all at once, and it's just heartbreaking. We watch Juno as time passes. Juno is a youth who becomes unhoused, and we just see her try to navigate the world. Eventually Juno and Legs are reunited, and we watch their love sort of pick up where they left off, blossom and bloom in this beautiful way. We see them try to understand each other as older humans and sometimes misunderstand each other, but never lose the tenacity of their love for one another. It's a book filled with a lot of tragedy, I think, but the love that's in it is so protective and life-giving. Like, it's just such a beautiful book. And I remember when I first read it, the question that I had around it was like, can a love that is so pure and so big, can that exist without a darkness tailing it? Like, is there always a sort of wreckage that is a result of a big love? And there's this idea of like, the deeper you love, the more space that you have created for sorrow. And that's sort of what we see here. There's a lot of sorrow, but there's also this depth that's created for love, or maybe the depth of that love has created a lot of space for the sorrow. But sorrow and love have sort of held hands in this book, and it's just a lovely, beautifully written story. I loved it when I read it. So definitely deserves a spot in my top 10. Number 5, The Wren by Anne Enright. This is a story about a mother and a daughter who are sort of threaded together by a father who is a poet. So we have this poet whose poetry intersperses the novel and is sort of like a spine. And we sort of see these two women generationally navigate around the absence of the father and the wisdom of the father, or like the artistry of the father. So what he has left through his poetry, but also what he has left through his absence. Carmel is the mother and Nell is the daughter. They're so different from each other. Carmel is a woman who, because of the absence of love in her life, has tried to reclaim the idea of love through her love for her daughter. And Nell is a young girl who is very occupied by pleasures and love in a romantic sense. She has a proclivity towards limerence and has these like kind of obsessive falling in loves with men. And so it's so interesting to see these very two different women navigate their family history, navigate each other, their differences, how they sort of reconcile those differences, and how they love each other, how they move through love with each other. I loved the voice of this. There was just something so warm about this book, and I loved being in Nell's perspective, and I loved being in Carmel's perspective. It's a book that I really want to reread, and I just enjoyed my time so much with this book. I got this copy when I was in Ireland as well, and it's a signed copy. I was almost going to meet Anne Enright, but it just didn't work out. So this is a special like physical object for me as well, but very much enjoyed this book. Number 4, Book of Delights by Ross Gay. This is a book that I have tried to read so many times. I was taking Amtraks and I read a lot of this on the Amtrak, and it was such a perfect read for being in a liminal space. This is essentially a book on Black joy. Ross set out to write an essay every day for a year, starting on his birthday, focusing on a delight. And something that he says in this is that the more he sort of attuned himself to delight, the more delights he encountered, which is just a tender premise to begin with. Ross Gay is a poet, and something that I started reading these aloud to myself, and there's so much musicality in his prose. It's very bluesy, and a lot of like his word choice is so musical. So I would recommend listening to this or reading it aloud to yourself. Aside from his beautiful language, there are some parts of this that are absolutely stunning. I remember, like, I haven't been caught like a deer caught in the headlights in a long time, but I felt that feeling. Like, I remember I was reading and I just like was shocked by how gorgeous this quote is. Here he says, "Among the most beautiful things I've ever heard anyone say came from a student, Bethany, talking about her pedagogical aspirations or ethos, how she wanted to be as a teacher and what she wanted her classrooms to be. What if we joined our wildernesses together? Sit with that for a minute. That the body, the life, might carry a wilderness, an unexplored territory, and that yours and mine might somewhere somehow meet, might even join. And what if the wilderness, perhaps the densest wild in there, thickets, bogs, swamps, uncrossable ravines and rivers, have I made the metaphor clear? Is our sorrow. It astonishes me sometimes. No, often how every person I get to know, everyone, regardless of everything, by which I mean everything, lives with some profound personal sorrow. Brother addicted, mother murdered, dad died in surgery, rejected by their family, cancer came back, evicted, fetus not okay. Everyone, regardless, always, of everything. Not to mention the existential sorrow we might all be afflicted with, which is that we and what we love will soon be annihilated. Which sounds more dramatic than it might. Let me just say dead. Is this sorrow the great wilderness? Is sorrow the true wild? And if it is, and if we join them, your wild to mine, what's that? For joining too is a kind of annihilation. What if we joined our sorrows, I'm saying, what if that's joy? Wasn't I just talking about sorrows and joys? But that, like, absolutely, I just had a lot of feelings about it. Joining our wildernesses together is definitely going to be my pickup line now. I'll use it for someone special. I think that's just such a profoundly gorgeous way of talking about a union and talking about togetherness. There is a lot more of that in this book, and it's just a gorgeous, beautiful book. I always talk about timing, and I like try to read this book so many times and it never fit. This book actually takes place at the beginning of Trump's presidency the first time. I'm so upset about having to say first time, but it happens around that. And so sometimes he tries to make sense of the world, you know, that has been abraded by the realities of Trump and what his presence in our lives means. And so to encounter this book at like a parallel, it was very sort of bizarre, but also like the most comforting thing. And so I really, really, really recommend this book. I have Inciting Joys and I'm so excited to read it, but I'm also like okay with taking my time getting to it. Yeah, I absolutely adored this book. So top three. This is a book that absolutely blew me away. I enjoyed this book so much and was also really thrilled by this book, and that is Clean by Alia Trabuco Ceran. So as the book opens, we're learning about the death of this girl, and we're learning about it through the housekeeper. Like the housekeeper is telling us the story of the death of this little girl. When we meet the housekeeper, she is being held and interrogated. So it has like a very eavesdroppy style of narrative, which is like, para las chismosas, my favorite thing. Essentially, we're watching this housekeeper argue around her innocence or retell the story of her time with this family and this little girl, what happened to the little girl. There is like a wriggling between affection, like she feels very affectionate towards this girl that she met literally as the family birthed her. Like she was, you know, hired right at the birth of this girl and watched her grow up, and so she feels this affection, but she also feels this disdain towards this girl. And so there is an exploration of like class and what it means to be subservient to someone, especially when it's a child. She talks about when she gazes at the girl's face, she feels tenderness, but she feels something wild and threatening to break loose. And as the story continues, we sort of see that constantly as like a thread or a theme is violence that sort of hems the mundane. It's violence both ways, like the threat of violence and then the type of violence that is done to someone in subservience. Also, she's looking at like the sinister things that reside in the margins of our compassion. It was just like a really fascinating exploration. When the housekeeper is telling the story, she's very manipulative. There's a lot of push and pull in the way that the story is told, so it keeps you like on your toes. The emotions that it's exploring and the ways that it's exploring it are so addictive. This is another book that I had struggled to put down. There's like a shock at the violence that you're capable of in this book. There is the sort of explorations around what it means to be of service to someone in perpetuity, what it means to see family members of yours die, of you to neglect yourself, your life, your loved ones to this subservience, how that becomes like a permanent fixture of your life, how you navigate that, how you maintain your personhood in that, and how easily then violence becomes available to you because these conditions are not natural. As we get closer to what happens, like how the little girl dies, it becomes really tense and really fun to follow along. And then there's like this infusion of political action that happens, which is also really fantastic. I believe it happens in Chile, somewhere in Latin America. I think it's Chile. But I so enjoyed this book. I highly recommend it. This was like such a fun time. There's a really pretty version of, like the UK version is very pretty. This one is not so pretty, but it doesn't matter because the book is fantastic. My number two, Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma by Claire Dederer. This is a book that is looking at the monstrosity of artists, whether we should be separating the art from the artist. What I love about this book, and something that I've seen critiqued about it, but that I really enjoyed about it, is that initially Claire is looking at art by male artists, and she's looking at how we sort of navigate the actions that these men often take. and the genius of their art. And then the book sort of switches and it's asking, what is the monstrous act for a woman? And she comes to the conclusion that that monstrous act is absconding from motherhood or neglecting your children as a mother. And so then she looks at different women artists and their decisions and how they decide to interact with motherhood. It's something that I just enjoy. I love reading about artists and mothers and how you navigate these two very consuming identities. There are some books that are mentioned, some artists that are mentioned that I have been interested in reading after reading this book, and it's one that I have constantly thought about. This is a book that I read, got to the absconding mother part, stopped it, and like started to read it again physically because I was listening to it initially. So I almost read this book twice, and it's one that I want to return to a third time because I really liked how Claire worked around these questions. And my favorite book of 2024, a book that I have literally not been able to stop thinking about. Every time I read something now, I'm comparing it to this book. It's a book that suspended me. It doesn't happen to me often, but books that sort of erase my reality and like really subsume me in the text are books that I hold so dear because it doesn't happen to me often. I think in terms of the honesty of this book, the writing in this book I underlined so much. What it brought up emotionally for me, the things that it made me confront about motherhood as someone who's not even a mother. I can't imagine reading this as someone who's a mother because it is such an honest book. It is a motherhood book, but I just think what this writer does is so phenomenal. I'm so grateful that I read this book. I will be rereading it. I urge anyone, if we have similar tastes, pick this book up if you haven't because it is just insane. It is so good. But my number one favorite book of 2024 is Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. This is a book that is about a mother who is sharing about her early days of motherhood to her son as almost like a bedtime story. But in this, she's really honest about the difficulties in raising her son. She starts by talking about how she tried to abandon her son, how there was like this tension, like she wanted so much to flee, but she was absolutely incapable of divorcing herself from her son. Throughout the text, we sort of see that as a continued theme, just like this tension between absolute adoration and devotion and like absolute resentment, and how those, when they're married together, create such a haze in someone's life, a haze that's really hard to see through and to make sense of. She's also here dealing with her disdain for her husband, how easily he has sort of absolved himself of all domestic responsibility. So it's a lot about like that silent warfare that women have in domestic spaces, kind of in line with what Sarah Manguso was doing in Liars. But she was looking at this little boy who was her epicenter, but she's also very honest with the fact that her son is difficult. He's a difficult son and he constantly pushes her. The heightened illustration of the emotions, of these very opposing emotions, and how our character sort of weaves herself through it is what made this such a addicting, enthralling, fascinating piece of work for me. It's very primal. I think the sort of struggle that she feels with wanting to maintain the integrity of her autonomy and her personhood and what she feels for her son is something that is depicted in such a primal way. All of the emotions just feel so animal in this book, which I think is what makes it, like, again, such an interesting read. The way that she claws and swings fiercely to keep her sense of self in this novel amongst the absolutely like annihilating love she feels for her child and the disdain that she feels, like, I think all of the emotions in this book are just so tall, and to see her navigate herself through that was an absolute, like, it's insane. This book is insane. Some of the ideas that sprouted up for me, like, to have new ideas about my own stance on motherhood is not something that I thought that I would be arriving at, but this book definitely took me there. And then the writing in this was absolutely superb. Yeah, I'm obsessed with this. I'm obsessed with it, and I'm really scared to read anything else by this writer because I don't understand how she could possibly do what she did in this book in other books. But yeah, I'm actually obsessed with this novel. Some quotes from here. When you were just a few months old, a small swaddled parcel who still fit in the pram attachment, I started those long walks around the hill. From the outside, it must have looked like I was trying to regain my figure, but I was trying to regain my mind. You're harnessed to this pram which you push up the hill and back down again all day, every day. Sisyphus. Insane. Here she says, I wasn't in my right mind anymore. I was firmly in my wrong mind and liable to do anything. So off I went, down the stairs, out the door, up the drive, through the gate, along the road, overcome by a wildness. I needed to convert to movement or else risk doing something stupid. And by stupid, I mean destructive, because words have many meanings, sailor. You must deploy them with care because they can inflict real hurt. Oh, I said in surprise to the cold night air, finding the transition to outdoors entirely radical. They say a mother forgets the pain of giving birth, but that is not my experience. It's everything outside of that pain she forgets. forgets. Everything that is not her child. In short, the rest of the world. But here it is. I have been shoveling coal in the bowels of the ship for so long that I'd forgotten it was even a ship. It was one big furnace that I had to keep stoking or else we'd run aground. Until a deck and an array of stars, the glittering ocean. My husband's quarters. Just like, ugh. Insane. You screamed and the toys were sent flying. You screamed while I stirred and buttered and pouted, while I gulped the tea my husband had left on the counter. Normally I would have relented and picked you up, but I had had it after the hair incident. I had had it that morning, as I had had it every morning and every afternoon and every evening since you were about 6 months old, since it had dawned on me that this was my life now. This was freelance motherhood, struggling to contain your screams while struggling to contain my own, which were louder and angrier and scared us both. You were learning free will that day. The very thing I was losing, you were gaining in inverse proportion. Your independence premised on dismantling mine. I wish I could reread this for the first time. Like, I want to, I don't know how, but I want to make this part of my being. Yeah, she is the moment. She is that girl. That's it. Those were our top 10 reads of 2024. I feel like we haven't chatted in a while, so please let me know what your favorite book of 2024 was. Or if you're feeling like you can't narrow it down, top 3. I love hearing what you guys have to say, and I have gotten so many good recommendations from what you guys have shared and have mentioned down in the comments. So let's chat down below. I hope you have a really happy new year. As always, I'm super, super grateful for y'all for sticking around and for chatting books with me. And yeah, we'll see each other in 2025. Bye.